Hello and welcome to TeleSUR's English Facebook Live conversation from Quito, Ecuador. I'm Sweeney Gray. Today TeleSUR turns 3. TeleSUR Spanish actually turns 12. So we decided we wanted to have a conversation about mainstream media and the place or the space for alternative media houses such as ourselves. So to join me in that conversation, I have with me in studio Sally Burch. She's with ALAI. ALAI is the Latin American news agency. They turned 40 this year, so congratulations. Joining me via Skype is Abby Martin. She's in Los Angeles. Abby is the host of Empire Files that you can see on TeleSUR. So if you haven't watched it, you should. And joining us from London is Daniel Renwick. Daniel is an independent journalist, and he's also worked on the Jeremy Corbyn campaign, and currently he is dealing with the aftermath of that horrible Grenfell fire. So thank you all of you for joining us right here from TeleSUR.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start with Abby, because Abby, Empire Files has just returned from Venezuela. So I wanted to ask you, what have you seen in Venezuela from your experiences being on the ground, talking to people? How has that differed from the mainstream media coverage of Venezuela?
Well, it never ceases to amaze me how much the mainstream media actually obfuscates the reality on the ground. A lot of the reports that you see coming out of Venezuela are simply quoting opposition figures or, reports that are hearsay. Before I went, I was very alarmed at the situation because I just kept seeing these heavily edited videos of quote unquote repression, right, on behalf of state forces. So going there, I was quite surprised to see the extreme violence at the protests. Essentially, we followed around one of these guarimbas and saw how they provoke state repression. So it was very interesting to see, the element of what is the violent protest, who's really responsible for the deaths. And when you break that down, and of course we got a lynch mob after us for just simply reporting those facts, but it goes well beyond just the protests, right? The reality on the ground there. I mean, it's the supermarkets, it's the food lines, it's the freedom of press. I mean, we simply went around the city completely unhindered. I bought every single newspaper that I could find, and over 60% was vehemently critical of the government, anti-government, pro-opposition newspapers. So it's simple things like that just completely blow your mind. You realize that the media just paints a very one-sided narrative to paint a picture, right? They have an agenda. Their agenda is to destabilize a democratic system, right, that is not bucking to global hegemony and U.S. empire. So it's extremely obvious when you say the way the corporate media paints Venezuela. Another really interesting thing is calling it a dictatorship. I mean, you go through every single corporate media platform, and it's just painting the same line, right? Maduro's a dictator consolidating power, and then you realize that their system is actually more democratic than the U.S. I mean, we went to mass rallies where hundreds, if not thousands of people were participating in these direct democratic processes. You would never see something like that here in the U.S. And of course, you just have to look at the Carter Center saying that they're actually the freest elections in the world back in 2004 to 2010. So it's quite amazing, the reality versus what we are told about the country. And it's really obvious why.
Okay, so thank you so much, Abby. So I wanted to actually talk about Latin American media. So I have Sally Burch in studio with me. ALAI is about 40 years old. How have you seen Latin American media cover themselves change in the 40 years that ALAI has been in existence?
When ALAI was born in 1977, it was a period of dictatorships in most of the region, and there was a serious restriction on the information you could get about the region or between one country and another. But there was a huge upsurge of popular communication initiatives. It was something that was really linked to the struggle against dictatorships, to communities organizing, particularly a community radio. At that time, as I said, the problem was in general a lack of information. And ALAI, one of the roles we took on as a regional alternative news agency was to network with the different local media that didn't have very much scope for dissemination beyond the local area. and so trying to build a broader sort of communications fabric or network in the region. Today, it's a different situation because we don't have a lack of information, we have an abundance of information. We have, in some countries, more openings for community media, for alternative media. Ecuador and Bolivia created a precedent by recognizing the right to communicate in their constitutions and assigning a third of the airwaves to alternative and community media. In practice, it hasn't always got to the point of full implementation.
How do you find, sorry to interrupt, but how do you find the international coverage of Latin America? How has that evolved in the 40 years?
In 40 years ago, it was mainly the large news agencies.
Right.
Today, there's a much more diversity of international coverage because newspapers and local media and televisions can all be on the web. Yeah. The difference for alternative media has been that we have a much broader scope for disseminating. We can get out further. It's easier to have media work. But we're still facing the fact that we're still marginalized. We're still second to what most of the mainstream media is putting out. And there's now a much more clearer alliance between mainstream politics and mainstream media.
So I want to bring Daniel into the conversation. Daniel, like we mentioned before, has been kind of close to the Jeremy Corbyn campaign. I'm referring to the recent UK elections. He has more recently been very close to the coverage of the Grenfell Tower fire. Daniel, what has your experience been comparing how the traditional media in the UK covered both Grenfell and Jeremy Corbyn? Like, what are they getting wrong and what are they getting right? And how has, I guess, new media changed their reality?
I mean, in certain ways, it's helpful to distinguish between the two cases. When it came to the new media and Jeremy Corbyn, some of the new media services, particularly Navarra Media, were very much on point with their analysis, a lot more than the mainstream media were. Aaron Bastani famously said the vote will keep going up and up and up. And he said this on Sky News, and he said it on his own networks, and was met with a level of ridicule at first, but that proved to be right. He was one of the few people within the public sphere who actually said and predicted the election result that we saw, and he consistently said that the vote was going to go higher than 2005, actually. And it was the biggest swing that Labour had had since 1945, so it was a very significant victory, and a lot of that did come through new media, quote unquote, but also, I mean, it's a very complicated picture that you have to build up to be able to rationalise and understand exactly how Jeremy Corbyn pulled off that feat. Some of it is a lot to do with new media, some of it is very much linked to getting the youth vote out, but also a lot of it was to do with the complete capitulation of the UKIP vote and Jeremy Corbyn playing a relatively ambiguous line when it came to the position of migrants and the complete eradication from any conception of migrant justice from what the mainstream left in the UK talks about, and a concession to the kind of nativist argument that migration leads to the reduction of wages. And it was being able to play both the youth optimism and the kind of nativist resentment.
But what do you think, in your estimation, Daniel, what do you think made the traditional media really unable to deal with Corbyn? I do remember seeing like one or two reports or persons admitting after, I think Jon Snow, after the election, said we absolutely got it wrong, the pundits got it wrong. But if you were looking at social media, those sort of grassroots organizations weren't getting it wrong. So what, in your estimation, as somebody who's in the UK, made the mainstream media so unable to deal with Jeremy Corbyn?
I think the biggest issue that they faced was it was hard to work out where the echo chamber of social media ended and genuine reflections of the public mood began. After the local elections, it seemed that it was tied up that Jeremy Corbyn was significantly behind the Tories and would not gain any seats. This was a widely held consensus based upon both polling data and previous election turnouts. And so it was on that basis and those extrapolations and those predictions that Jeremy Corbyn was consigned to the dustbin of history before the election had even taken place. And it was that that gave Jeremy Corbyn the ability to fight in an election campaign that kind of was no holds barred, optimistic, relentless, and within that mood managed to capture something. It was also the fact that Theresa May ran an absolutely shockingly bad election. She worked, she rested on her laurels, she looked at the polling data, and she thought that as long as she didn't hold the ball, she couldn't be tackled. And the thing is that she gave up possession and let Jeremy Corbyn determine the debate. And that happened not just with the policy points, but also when things like the Manchester bombings happened and the attacks happened, it was Jeremy Corbyn who was able to effectively communicate that message. Some of it was relatively problematic, in my opinion. There was an acceptance of the intelligence services. There was a uncritical acceptance of the need for 20,000 more police on the streets. Those things fall into a kind of law and order conservative tradition. But it was the way he was effectively able to do that while connecting it to a kind of socialism with Brexit that managed to tap into a public mood that get youthful metropolitan voters united with those who were flirting with UKIP beforehand.
Okay. Thank you so much, Daniel. Let me bring Abby back into the conversation. Abby, you are an independent producer who produces a show with TeleSUR. Do you think that we're at a time now where the mainstream media is sort of not fulfilling their mandate? So we need these alternative media agencies to do what mainstream media should be doing?
Well, of course. I mean, I think we saw that more than ever with the DNI report that came out. The Director of National Intelligence came out allegedly on behalf of 17 agencies saying, here's the proof, right, why Russia hacked our election, quote unquote. And when you read the report, you realize that almost all of it was just an indictment on Russia Today, Russian-funded state media, right, which of course fills in the gap. Half of America's in poverty. Half of America's living paycheck to paycheck. So when that's not reflected in the corporate media structure, when the corporate media structure paints everyone, you know, America is great and we're an exceptional country, we're the best in the world, and if you're not working hard enough, then you're not doing it right, and you're not as rich as Trump, then you're not fulfilling the American dream. Of course, people watching these corporate media agencies and becoming completely distrustful of them, right? Completely disenfranchised from what the narrative is on the mainstream. So they turn to outlets like Russia Today. For issues of coverage of police brutality, for coverage of corruption on Wall Street, right? What is the mainstream media missing? How does state media fill the gap? And you see that, yeah, and it's a huge threat to the establishment, of course, when they paint Russia Today as the reason why fake news has proliferated the consciousness and why Trump won. They're really missing the boat here on why people are turning to outlets like Russia Today, why people are turning to outlets like TeleSUR, because they are not getting the story from the corporate media.
Thank you so much, Abby. Let me just remind you, this is a Facebook Live conversation where you can take part. So if you have questions, please send them in and we will try and put them to the panel. And since Abby brought up the subject of fake news, I think I want to ask Daniel about that a bit. What are your thoughts? Is there fake news?
Yeah, but I don't think it's a particularly new phenomenon. I think for me, there's always been this very problematic kind of imposition of this idea of false news or fake news, whereas in reality we just call it postmodernism. We've got into a point of mass skepticism. We've got into a point where, as anyone who monitors the social media streams of alternate media will see, it's the false flag that is the speculation of almost anyone, any event that happens in the world. Within hours of me being on the ground in Grenfell, my social media posts were being targeted because people were saying it was a ritual human sacrifice. And this type of mentality exists out there because people would rather believe a conspiracy that allows them to explain the complications of everyday life more than they would the need for constant inquiry and constant filling in of that information. And because the mainstream media has failed so abundantly to do that, those who simplify the narrative are the ones who people are drawn towards.
Okay, so Daniel, let me just interrupt you a second. We're having some issues with your visual. So we need to just sort that out. But let me ask Sally, not to put you on the spot, but fake news with President Trump in power, his entire election, we were hearing about fake news, post-truth, and I can't remember the other term. What do those words mean to you, and how relevant are they in the current discussion about media?
As Daniel said, fake news isn't new, and I think it's always been part of military strategy. And today, when we're moving into this phase of fourth generation wars, where military strategy is part of politics, then fake news becomes more permanent, more ongoing. And maybe another difference now to before is with new technologies and with these algorithms that can send to each person the kind of news that they want to hear. You get a less critical audience. And one of the main things that could stop a flow or put a limit to fake news before was the credibility of a media outlet. Because if you spread too much fake news and then it comes out that it's false, you lose your credibility. Today, that's almost no longer relevant because people are just receiving information from all kinds of different sources. And next week it comes out that it wasn't true, but you're already on to the next news item and you've forgotten about last week's. Yeah. So I think there's a really serious problem here and the need for not just serious journalism, people and sources that can verify what's true and what's not. Yeah, but also how people receive news
has changed.
It has changed, and how it's changing in some ways for the worse.
But that whole fake news discussion, shouldn't it make mainstream media very concerned that maybe they're not doing their jobs properly, that maybe they're resting on their laurels, they're elitists, they have a certain audience, and they only play to that audience?
I think the idea of the mainstream media doing their jobs properly is also something that they're not even looking at anymore.
Right.
I mean, as I was just mentioning before, there's an increasing link between mainstream media and neoliberal politics. Yeah, and media have become an actor in politics. Yeah, and this is something that's very clear to the right wing, and I think the left wing has remained in sort of. I think it's good that the left wing doesn't try to follow that idea of creating your own false news, right? Yeah. But they've remained in the sort of the liberal idea of the free press, where there shouldn't be any sort of state intervention. And you do need some kind of regulation of how the media works. Yeah, so the left has been much more cautious of touching the mainstream media, even when they're completely overruling what their role should be.
Which is what I think we have Daniel back. Hi, Daniel, are you back?
Yeah, I am indeed.
Okay, great. So I wanted to bring you back into the conversation because obviously you were talking to us about fake news and your experiences with Grenfell and how people were turning to your coverage because it seemed to have more value. Could you just talk a little more on that, your experiences with Grenfell and how people were responding to your coverage as opposed to BBC, Sky, ITV, the mainstream media outlets in the UK?
When I hit the ground in Grenfell, I was told that there were 12. 12 people were dead. Now, the reality of what people saw was that they saw people in their windows who couldn't get out. They saw that the numbers of dead were significantly higher. The minute we started to speak to survivors, we realized that the stairwells were filled with bodies. We spoke to firemen off the record who spoke of numbers well over 100 on the first day. And so it became very clear that you had the suppression of information for political purposes, which I believe will come out to be a public order issue.
Can I just ask you about that a little bit? You're saying for political purposes, but isn't it the responsibility of the media to make sure that the information is verified first? Like you have to take it from the official sources? What's your concern or critique of that standard?
The problem is it's the conditions of the fire. So while you have firemen who say that there were over 100 bodies within the first 12 hours, that fire raged for 23. And by the time they managed to turn the gas off and by the time they managed to extinguish the fire, the place had got hotter than a crematorium, and most of those bodies were incinerated. Above the 12th floor, I have it on very good a very good source that says that the body parts aren't big enough and they're completely calcified. So the pathological work that is going to have to be required to be able to do an identification or a thorough analysis of the amount of people in that building is now so vast that some people are talking of a margin of error of 60 people, of whether they will be accurate or not. Now, it was in that first 24 hours that I think that there was, and it's the first week that people could have been a lot more forceful in making sure the government looked after what is essentially a crime scene at Grenfell Tower. Their inability to do that, their inability to wrap the building, and a lot of the compromise of information means that we, people like myself, and the vast majority of people in North Kensington are now being labelled by the mainstream media as conspiracy theorists, because we challenged the number of 340 people being in the building at the time. If you just take what the mainstream media themselves reported, the BBC Panorama report that came out within a week of the disaster stated that there were 500 people in the building. But given a month afterwards, that's now been reduced to 340, their source now being the Metropolitan Police. But how these numbers have been worked out is still very opaque. And the reality of what most people are contending with on the ground is a feeling that there has been consistent suppression of information for political purposes, fearing public disorder. And that can be corroborated by the response of the emergency services themselves, with armed response units and riot squad on the ground from around 2 a.m. while the fire was burning. So the fire had been burning for less than 2 hours, and you already had a public order issue on the streets. And it's that breeds this distrust. And I don't know if anybody can really look at the media as a provider of truth, especially when you look at the way they talk about survivors. And when they talk about survivors, they talk about the amount of people housed in hotels, but they don't distinguish between people who are residents of the tower or the finger blocks to the tower.
Fair enough, Daniel. You made a very valid point about you don't think. Let me hear if I'm. You can correct me if I'm not hearing you correctly. When you say you don't think people can look towards the media for their news, is that correct?
I think that after what has happened there, particularly for the people of North Kensington and those who are on the ground, there is a different relationship they have with the media now, correct, which is well established.
Okay.
Because the media allowed the state to determine the story, and there was certainly very little grassroots journalism that took place. And actually, journalism in every
Let me
sense
just interrupt you. I'm so sorry, Daniel. Let me just interrupt you again, because I want to bring Abby into the conversation, because, again, Abby is an independent news producer. And, Abby, I'm probably going to give you a very hard task, so please forgive me in advance. What sort of thing, not that we want to be mainstream media, but what thing do you think that mainstream media is getting really, really wrong? And what can they do to address their inability to cover issues properly, in your estimation?
Well, I think that it's the wrong move to say, how could they start listening to us? How could they start covering issues correctly? We know that that's never going to happen. They're a corporate-based, profit-making system. I mean, we see Les Moonves, the head of CBS, saying Trump is horrible for America, but he's damn good for CBS. I mean, that is literally the mentality of these news agencies. It's about what makes advertising, what makes ratings. There's so many conflicts of interest that go into there, not to mention the self-censorship, not to mention the sheer stenography of these journalists who essentially just echo state propaganda. So they like to bemoan TeleSUR in Russia Today as state propaganda, yet they literally echo the State Department and do not question what they are told from Pentagon officials and just simply print it as news. I wanted to just add on to the fake news conversation. I mean, I think that we are coming into a dangerous, treacherous territory when it comes to fake news, because like you guys have been saying, fake news has always existed, right? I mean, essentially every war has been fought on the premise of fake news, from the Spanish-American War to the Vietnam War, to 9/11. I mean, there's different stories that are emboldened, that are exaggerated, that are used on behalf of the state to push us into endless conflicts, on the basis of humanitarian interventions, for example, in Syria, Libya, and beyond. But now it's gotten into a bizarre territory where it's become weaponized by the state. On one half of the story, you have the Trump administration using fake news to call everything that doesn't worship him fake news, right? Anything except Breitbart. And then you have Breitbart and InfoWars whispering in the ear of the president, which I think is extremely dangerous, because if you look at fake news, I mean, what's a better example than InfoWars, than Alex Jones, right? Like Daniel was saying, I mean, filling in all of the gaps where everything's staged, everything's a conspiracy, yet it's only the Democrats who are conspiring, right? But then you have corporate media outlets and the so-called resistance, the Democratic establishment, and corporate news outlets like Washington Post and the New York Times, the so-called papers of records that have been time and again wrong. I mean, you can point to every single war, and it's the New York Times at the basis of it, calling for intervention. They've gotten it wrong time and again. But then you have them weaponizing the term fake news and actually publishing lists. You saw that propaganda or not list put out, proliferated by Washington Post. And what it was essentially was just calling out all non-corporate media as so-called fake news. I mean, they included Truthdig, Counterpunch, Truthout in this vast list to demonize everyone that's not corporate funded, and this kind of establishment journalism news that's looked at as so great in the Beltway. All of that's fake news, right? So it's a very dangerous territory when you have people who are radical progressive journalists who are doing the work, doing the actual investigative work, and called fake news blanketly by the establishment. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's calling everything fake news that doesn't agree with them. So we as journalists have to put on our media literacy hats and really understand how we can tread this territory, being media literate, and understanding the consumption of media and what the agenda is, and tread lightly, and get your news from a variety of sources. I always tell people, become media literate. That is the most important thing that we can do as critical thinking citizens right now to fight back.
Thank you so much, Abby. I just want to remind you, if you're watching us live on Facebook, you can join the conversation. Please don't be shy. So following on from what Abby was saying, Sally, about being media literate, what sort of advice do you have for journalists who are working today on how to cover whatever it is they're covering properly, how to cover their world properly? Because obviously we have, at ALAI, the alternative Latin American news agency. You're fulfilling a need. What do modern journalists need to do their jobs properly as members of the Fourth Estate?
Well, you need to look at the different sources. You need to,
like what Abby was saying,
verify
get news from
where
a
they're
variety.
getting the news from, and what version is behind the source that you're getting the information from, and to look at that critically. But obviously one of the problems, and I think one of the reasons where the news quality has deteriorated so much, is that the financial model of newsmaking has completely changed, or is changing very fast. Yeah, the advertising model wasn't necessarily the best one, because it was basically corporate backed, to the kind of things Abby was saying. But at least there used to be some sort of firewall between the advertising sector and the news sector of a newspaper, for example, or a television channel. That's fading fast. The big corporations now are investing in media and telling them what they have to do. Yeah, and most of the advertising money is now going directly to people through Google, Facebook, and social networks in general. So there's now much less money available for good journalism. Yeah, so I think we seriously need to look again at what society needs to get good, serious information.
How can social media help alternative media outlets? Because I know it's treated with a lot of scorn in some circles, but social media is how a lot of people now are getting their news. How would social media help ALAI and other alternative media outlets like TeleSUR?
Social media can help reach a broader audience, yeah, but with very serious limitations on how you reach them because of the format of the message, and because these are mostly platforms that are run by large corporations. And they decide, you don't even know who your information is reaching. If you do it on Facebook, Facebook decides who you reach and who you don't. Yeah. So there's very serious limitations to depending too much on these platforms, but at the same time, that's where most people are, so that's one of the best places to reach people.
True.
So it's complex.
It is. Abby, I know you're traditional media. Well, not traditional, but you're not on what do you think about online? How do you think online can help non-traditional journalists or independent journalists such as yourself?
I mean, it's a great question, and I think that's why we've seen grassroots citizen journalism explode. This consciousness come out of the corporate media being an abysmal failure, right? People detaching from ingesting media in the traditional sense and going towards social media because they can get different forms of aggregation. I think Twitter's a really great direct way that you can just follow the journalists, right? Not even necessarily, you go to CNN, you go to Fox, you go to Counterpunch, you go to TeleSUR, but you can actually just go follow the journalists that you appreciate and respect from these different outlets directly. So, but then again, Twitter's of course seen different algorithms that are restricting and inhibiting that direct kind of aggregation model. Facebook, I think, is totally dead. I mean, we've seen what they've decided to do, which is basically collect money if you want any of your audience to see your news. So that's a really screwed up model. Of course, we have to use these if you're using. It's all about promotion, right? Advertising yourself. So you have to put your stuff out there on Facebook. It's terrible. And then we just saw what happened with YouTube, where now they won't allow or monetize certain terms, right? Certain words that are politicized. So you see different politicization of different social media platforms that are definitely restricting the ability. I think what it all comes down to is we cannot put our trust in any one of these corporations. We cannot put our ability to ingest media on any sort of one platform. Facebook, Google, they like to paint themselves as on the side of the people, but we see that they will work with the State Department time and again. They will relinquish all of our information to sell us out. And that's what we are. We're data, we're consumers. So I think that social media is great. It also is a double-edged sword, and it's about us creating those new platforms, creating the new things like Minds.com, different sort of cooperative networks that we can use outside of these, also within them, but to ultimately change the game so we're not stuck falling back on these platforms that are ultimately out of our hands and that can be shut down at any given instance.
Thank you so much, Abby. Danielle, Abby was, I guess, a little less enthusiastic about social media than I guess some people have been. Talk to me about what you think the role social media can have in news gathering and news watching, and what sort of concerns you have for the platform in general.
I mean, I think social media has opened us up to so many different information sources that it can only be considered a good thing so long as you have the time to read. What I think is problematic is that a lot of people don't actually have the time to read, so share articles without necessarily knowing it, which is where fake news gets its basis from, because you see it all the time. If you're involved in radical politics of any real slant, you'll be added by somebody or followed by somebody, and then there'll be the dissemination of information that you know to be factually incorrect and people aren't doing their work. You also have the move more and more and more now towards video, which is something that isn't being discussed. But if you look at someone like BuzzFeed's revenue model, they see themselves as making, I think it's 60% of their revenue from video, going up to 80% within the decade. Places like The Guardian are now constantly asking you to give them money and looking at ways in which they can enter into a more multimedia platform because of the way in which people are consuming news in an entirely different way. If you share a video, for example, on Facebook, the way that you make that, you optimize it to the best of your ability is that you write transcription as well, so that people can watch it silently. You are constantly trying to work out how you win over somebody to spend the 2-3 minutes, maybe 5, that you are asking for their time. And the way you do that is a compelling edit, a notable figure or a subject area that entices them. And then you also have the annotation of text and subtitles, which is a very time-consuming thing, and actually means that you're not necessarily doing journalism, you're doing narrative. You're allowing the wants of people, and I mean, in some ways you're challenging the kind of uber capitalism of mainstream media, but by playing into it as kind of product and essentially pushing it as a product, we are losing what I would call the kind of basis of journalism, which is truth. Essentially what we want to be doing is talking truth to power and finding ways of doing that. And I think we have to hold our hands up enough at the moment and be able to say that we're not doing that effectively enough. And that social media as it stands isn't necessarily our friend in this pursuit. Not at this moment in time. We do need to be a bit more rigorous in the way that we go about that. How we do that, I think, is a big question. I think what we see with the change towards video is very interesting, but it's about how text responds. And I think probably the one place that is relatively interesting in terms of how it's done this is Jacobin, which I haven't seen really images or video being pushed forward. It is consistent essays related to quite high-level analysis of contemporary events.
And that's an unusual social media model, because they keep saying that video is king in online. So we're talking about new and alternative media, and there's a new world for media. What sort of tips do you have for the consumers of media in this new reality that we're existing in?
Historicize everything.
I think, sorry.
Sally?
For me? Yeah. I think it's very important to check where the information is coming from and not take at face value anything you read online.
Consider the source.
And consider it as a valid source. So you need to find out what sources offer information that's been verified or is based on solid facts. And I think you need to create, maybe not only read the things you agree with too.
Right.
So that you can have an idea of what's happening in the world. Because one of the dangers now is that the public has become so sectoralized that people only read
what you're interested in.
What they're interested in and what agrees with their viewpoint.
Right.
And that means that we no longer have this sort of space for some degree of social consensus or social debate even.
Right.
Yeah? Which could be a problem.
Thank you so much.
It can contribute to exacerbating conflicts, for example.
That's true. Thank you so much, Sally. Abby, I wanted to actually put that question to you. What sort of tips do you have to people who are just consumers of news in this reality? What should they be doing to make sure that they're getting the best view possible?
Sure. I was going to say another downside of social media, of course, is the reactionary mindset that we now just react to a 24-hour news cycle, and we're not being responsible, right, anymore, which is the ability to respond cogently, coherently to a narrative that's going on and unfolding around us. And it goes back to the critical thinking and media literacy, ingesting news from a variety of different sources, understanding the agenda that comes behind that news, and also just don't react. You don't need to go out there and make a YouTube video every time that there's a news story out there. I mean, understand, take into account the different angles of a story. And if you want to actually perform journalism, it's much more long-lasting and worthwhile to the contribution of public consciousness and to the progress of this movement, right, the revolution, to actually understand an issue, do long-form investigative journalism. And that's a great way to contribute to what's going on. Don't just make a YouTube video and throw out just some views within a couple hours of an event unfolding. So that's what my advice to content creators. And as far as news consumers, absolutely media literacy is the most important thing that you could possibly do from a variety of different sources.
And again, I don't want to put you on the spot, Abby, but traditional media outlets, or I guess alternative facing, but yet terrestrial television, like TeleSUR, is that model outmoded, and is it coming to the end of its use, do you think?
No. I mean, I think look at why TeleSUR is so incredible. It is the only outlet like it. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, RT exists in its own kind of periphery, but TeleSUR is an incredible outlet that has existed to challenge this corporate media hegemony that paints all issues through the lens of U.S. empire in a favorable way. So this is a crucial outlet. I think it's just at the beginning phases of how huge it could really be. It's speaking truth to power. It's speaking from the eyes of the marginalized and oppressed, from the stories that we do not hear, right? History is written by the winners. TeleSUR is retelling that narrative, giving people like me, radical progressive journalists, a voice that we never had before. This is an incredible journey. I'm so excited to be a part of it. And I think TeleSUR is just one of many opportunities for progressive journalists to utilize these things. But I think when you're looking at, there's a duopoly. There's state media and corporate media. State media exists for a very special reason. It can fill in the gaps where you can talk about U.S. empire, you could talk about corporate hegemony, which you cannot do in corporate media. So state media serves an extremely crucial role and function in society today. And when journalism is based on advertising and when it's a profit-making model, that is the only option that we have to tell the truth. And that's why I'm on this platform.
Thank you so much, Abby, and we're so grateful to have you and the Empire Files on our platform. Thank you so much for contributing from Los Angeles. Do I have that correct?
Yes.
Perfect. And thank you so much for Daniel Renwick. Daniel is in London. He stayed up late just to join this conversation. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us.
Thank you.
And Sally Burke from ALAI, the alternative Latin American news agency. Thank you for joining me in studio. This has been a very interesting conversation on the state of media in 2017 and beyond. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Soini Gray. See you next time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.